Hey everyone, it's nice to see you all again.
We'll get started in just a moment. We're expecting a couple of more folks, but
May I ask a quick question? I was responsible for making sure your books got to you. Did anyone not receive a book in the mail? Okay, great. You all got them then.
well, that's so goal number one accomplished. It's all downhill from here. May I simply open with prayer? Is that okay? God, we thank you. We thank you for what you have already done. We thank you that you sent your son to live and die and rise again. We thank you for your spirit that you have planted within us. We thank you for your church that binds us together. And I pray that you will allow this conversation to build up your church, that we may serve you in your name. Amen. So, welcome everyone. What I'd like to do to start out with is just simply allow each person to introduce themselves. I'm looking for this, this is my name, this is where I'm located, just so that we remind each other who's the faces in front of us. We've all seen most of the faces in front of us, but it feels more personable if we can just simply start by having people say their names. And so, how about this? Michael, you go first, and then just folks jump in. And if it lags, I'll say a name. So I'm Scott Cormode. I'm calling from Fuller Seminary, and I'm happy to be here this morning. Michael, go ahead.
I'm Michael Wilson, calling from my home in Birmingham, Alabama.
Great.
I'm Jessie Bazan. I'm part of the coordination team at the Collegeville Institute in central Minnesota.
Jane Anga, and I'm calling in from Fort Myers, Florida.
And you work with Vibrant Faith.
I am Saeed Richardson. I'm from the Samuel Lewitt Proctor Conference, and I'm calling in from Chicago, Illinois.
And I'm Nancy Going from Durham, North Carolina, also with Vibrant Faith.
I'm Laura Aponte, calling from Louisville, Kentucky.
Nathan Hayes, calling from Waco, Texas.
Hello, everyone. I am Janae Moore. And unfortunately, you can't see me because my video will not come on for some reason. However, I am in Maryland, and I am with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference as well. Good to see all of you, even though you can't see me.
Thank you. Rodney?
Yes, Rodney McCauley. And you made reference, Scott, to face. The face that you may have been accustomed to seeing is actually my bride, Leslie. And she invited me to this group. So I'm representing both of us this morning or this afternoon, depending upon where you're at, of course, from Spokane, Washington.
Those are tough shoes to fill.
You better believe it. And 43 years of working at it, and I'm only scratching the surface of getting started.
Thank you. Does anybody left?
I'm Jessie Duisberg. I work with Scott at Fuller.
I'm Carrie Burns. I work for Stanford University for the Center of Congregational Resources.
Great.
And I think I'm last. I'm Kelly Adams, and I'm in Birmingham too at Stanford University.
Oh, and we've got one more coming on. So in a moment, we'll wait for a second and see if Elsie shows up. Okay. Well, we're going to get started. And let me tell you kind of the structure of how I'd like things to go. There were 3 chapters that we were going to cover this time. I am let's put it this way. You are used to like professors professoring, like behind a podium and, pontificating. I'm not really very interested in that. And so if at any point somebody has something they want to say, jump in. The other thing that I will say is that what we'll do is we'll do about 15 minutes on each of the 3 chapters. So we'll cover them. What I'll do is I'll typically say chapter 1, and then I'll name a couple of the things we covered just so that you can be reminded of them. And then I'll ask a question. And I want you to think like a politician here. You know how politicians, if they're asked a question that they didn't want to be asked, they will reject the premise of the question and ask the question they wanted to be asked? If I ask a question and it's not the one you wanted to be asked, just simply jump in with an answer to a completely different question. What's more interesting to me is what you are thinking than what I am thinking. And so that's really where I'm going here. So we're going to start out with chapter 1, which is an overview of the book. It starts with the phrase, or with the sentence, "The church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists." And it talks about the questions that we are, or instead of giving answers for churches, it says here are questions churches can ask, because that allows each church to construct it in their own context. And it talks about a different understanding of the nature of leadership, especially agile leadership, that it needs to be based on planting and watering and not on a mechanistic understanding of you follow these 3 rules and you get this result. So let me simply ask the first question is, in what ways is the church as you know it calibrated for a world that no longer exists? So rather than have you all jump in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to we're going to pause for a minute, and I'm going to ask you to either write down on a piece of paper or write down on inside the book or in your computer something. I'm going to give you a minute to think about ways in which the church is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. And then I'm going to, at the end of that minute, ask you all to just type in whatever you could think of into the chat, and then we'll have a conversation about it. So that way everybody gets a chance to speak. And if you don't decide to put anything in the chat, we're not keeping score. No one's going to know. So I'm going to pause now and give you a minute. In what ways is the church as we know it calibrated for a world that no longer exists? About 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to invite anybody who wrote something down just to start dumping into the chat so that we can kind of get a sense of all the different ways in which the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. If you've thought of 3 ways, write 3 different chats. Modes of communication, hierarchy, education on Sunday school, worship and education spaces, language, preaching, silos, deep divisions, the interpretation of scripture, multi-divisions, how young people are engaged. A brick and mortar edifice is the church, formation of leaders, imagery, all these different things. This is wonderful because if I'd asked any one of you, we would have gotten a pretty narrow understanding, but all of these different ways, churches built for Sunday morning, all these different kinds of things. I love this. So the premise of this book is that the church will have to innovate in the face of all these ways in which the church is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. And that the problem is that if we innovate our way forward, if we're not careful, we're going to lose our rock solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel. And so it's going to propose eventually that we're going to use practices to do this. But let me start by just simply saying, does anybody have a response or something they'd like to say, either about the idea that the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists, or a preliminary statement about the need for innovation, and we're going to talk in a moment about what innovation means, or if they'd like to say something about this nature of leadership as being about planting and watering, and not like building a building. Does anybody want to jump in? And I'm not going to, you don't have to raise your hand and call on you. I'm going to let you all speak.
Scott, you said in the preface that you met with a group that was kind of closed off to some new ideas. And then when the pandemic hit, they were clamoring for things that were new and would help them adapt. And I just can't help but think and wonder what our churches would look like if we were more open to entertaining ideas of new things, ministries, ways of being and doing church before we needed them so desperately.
Yeah, that's a tricky one, because I think, Ronald Heifetz likes to say, people don't resist change, they resist loss. And I have this wonderful example that one of my students brought up to me one time. They said, say you go to the doctor, and the doctor says to you, I've got good news for you. The kind of cancer that you have is imminently treatable. I think it's going to be a year of difficulty, but a year from now, I think you're going to be in a better place. Is that good news or bad news? Well, it depends. Did you know you had cancer? If you didn't know you had cancer, you go, whoa, wait, time out. What? And I think so often we come to the church hoping to solve problems that they have not yet discovered. And so the pain of going through it doesn't feel like it's worth it to them, because they haven't discovered that this is a solution to a problem that they are feeling. And that's why the idea of how we're calibrated for a world that no longer exists, there's a discovery process people need to make. Other thoughts or comments before we go on?
Scott, we've talked with our congregations at the Collegeville Institute about this idea of vocational grief, which kind of seems to align with what Kelly was saying, and how, especially this year, people just didn't expect, no one could have envisioned what 2020 would have brought. And so it's in some ways feels innovative, but in other ways it's the most basic church calling since the very beginning, to journey with people in this grief and to help them be able to see and acknowledge that what they're going through and these big changes, these big life changes, that it's okay to name that as grief and to mourn that together in community. And I wonder about innovative ways that we can do that now in a space where we kind of have to be separate for the most part, not physically together. But yeah, that grief seems to be hanging really heavy.
So in the second paragraph of the book, it starts talking about a woman named Erica, who was in one of our cohorts and worked especially with middle schoolers. And what we tried to do is get them to pay attention to Christian practices, because we see the Christian practices as tied together. Like, for example, I don't see how you can practice vocation without talking about things like worship or other Christian practices. And the Christian practice that ended up resonating the most with these middle schoolers is the idea of lament. Now, I don't know about you, but I didn't learn about lament till I was in seminary. Yet one of the things that we've run this process through with about 100 churches at this point. And one of the practice that has been the most widely used is for them to discover lament, because they discover that the Christian response The biblical response to grief, the biblical response to loss is lament. And that the message of lament is that God can handle our honesty and we can cry out to God. And that one of the ways in which we've talked about it is helping people talk to God the way the Psalms talk to God, with grief and gratitude, with grief and praise, with lament and praise. And so we haven't had a number of churches that have built on this idea of lament and praise. And so you're absolutely right for grief, but it turns out there's already a biblical structure that we can point to that helps them to deal with grief and that allows them to, even the form. So one of the things it talked about in the book is that we end up using a Mad Lib structure to help middle schoolers to follow form criticism and how they talk about lament. So yeah, grief is just crucial because, when Kelly was asking about what churches ready to change, they have to go through a grief process before they're really ready to face something. That go back to that doctor. If I had not already gone through a grief process about being told that this guy has cancer, then that guy's not really ready to face the cancer yet. So that grief process, I think, I think of lament as almost the first required practice, because it's the transition that allows us to open up our doors for all the other ones. Anything else before I go on to the second chapter?
I was going to add that in the spirit of okayness, I think it's oftentimes when we hear that, the church isn't built for today, and then the conversation around innovation, in terms of that first chapter, there's the expectation that everybody will learn to innovate and everybody will learn to make the new model. And in the spirit of okayness, it's okay if you don't. And I know as I talk with one of my really close friends, she always reminds me is that we oftentimes use the language that a church is dying and they can't make that jump to the next phase. She encourages me to sort of rethink about it as a church is just finishing its race. And finishing the race is a part of the Christian process. And that means it's okay. You don't necessarily have to make that jump. And some folks just won't. And it's part of the process is also helping folks understand how to finish the race gracefully.
Yeah, I love that. My understanding of Christian grace is that God is constantly making an offer rather than God is constantly making a demand. God is constantly inviting me to a better way of being. God is constantly offering the gift of grace. But there are people that are just not ready for it. There are people who just say, I'm good. Just let me. Okay. My job is to do what God does, is just make that offer. And run with the people that run and grieve with the people that grieve. And that's our job. I don't get to wag my finger at people and judge them, please. Anything else before I go on to chapter 2? Michael, you gestured. I wasn't sure if were you trying to say something? No, okay. Okay. Well, so chapter 2 is about the very meaning of innovation. Oftentimes we think of innovating as a better way to make money or a better way to do a building or something. And the chapter argues that meaning making is the essence of innovation, that we need to make new meaning. And that specifically we have to make meaning about the things that matter most in people's lives. And that the way we do that is by reinventing their mental models. And so let me start by just simply asking you, what do you think of this idea of a new mental model? There's a whole piece in there about Mark chapter 8 and the ways in which Jesus offers a new mental model. What do you think of this idea of meaning making, and what do you think of this idea of mental models? Any thoughts or comments on that?
I have a comment on it. I teach change making and social change with high schoolers and college students, young adults. And this idea was like the missing piece for me. I feel like they want to jump in and do the fun part of the innovation process kind of thing, but it doesn't stick unless the first thing has been done. You've taken time to do that. So thank you for that missing piece.
Well, great. I'm glad. Thank you. It's not mine. I got it from Jesus. So one way to think about it is the idea of a new mental model comes through a story. We are inviting people into a new story. Take your story and my story and weave it together with the biblical story to create a new story of shared hope, a shared story of future hope. What do you think of this idea of communicating a new mental model through a new story? Does that fit with your experience with congregations? Is that a new thing? Is that something that we can work on with congregations? Do you think that would resonate with congregations? What is this idea, in your mind, the idea of inviting people into a new story?
I like the idea of the new mental model, and especially your example about the MRI machine. On the other hand, what I wonder is what the line is between a story that helps us change our mental model and absolute fiction, i.e. the big lie. What's the difference between that and total mythology?
So that's a great question. What do you all think? In chapter 1, it talks about how painful the big lie is. And in chapter 2, it talks about inviting people into a new story. How do we know we're not the big liars? So what do you all think about the difference between a new story and the big lie?
I think the new story would only have significant meaning if it's biblically based and based on truth. And I think that we have guidance and direction to let us know what that is. And that becomes imperative in the story. To me, I thought of where scripturally it says we are made a quote unquote new creature in Christ. So the new story for me is in alignment with that process and that journey to be a new creature. And being able to examine the concepts, precepts, cosmologies, theologies that we hold, really examining what pictures that create and what reality is that creating based on our actions and behaviors, not just what we say. And I would lift up particularly what happened last week, the insurrection at the Capitol. There were people in the midst who had the Jesus Save signs and, the use of Christian imagery and symbology that was totally antithetical to the actions and behaviors that we saw before us. So it's having, having consistency and alignment with not just the words, but also the deeds with this new story.
Thank you, Janae. That's really helpful. I mean, the idea that, the question that animates the book is how do we maintain a rock solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel while to create innovative spirit for communicating that gospel in an ever-changing culture? And what Janae's brought up is that the rock solid commitment to the unchanging Christian gospel creates for us boundaries. It also creates for us ballast. It keeps us from being blown away here and there by the big lies. All we can do is offer people what we have already received. From 1 Corinthians, I offer to you what I have received. That's what we can do. That's what keeps us from inhabiting the big lie, and that allows us to have the community of faith that can call us on it.
And inherent in that would be the necessity of having a tough conversation that we have avoided as a country for far too long, that makes that story be inclusive and really is indicative of the gospel message of love that Jesus modeled and lived, in which Christian principles are based.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah, it seemed too that at one point in the book, you talk about how mental models are oversimplification. So they're always going to have shortcomings. And I mean, that very knowledge seems to raise a certain approach to life that, like, if I approach life knowing that my mental model is overly simplistic, then, and if I want to, have a more accurate mental model, which I would hope, most people would want, then I'm going to want to engage in the kind of practices that you talk about, this kind of empathetic listening across difference, finding people, who may offer different stories and who may shed light on my own oversimplifications. And that takes a lot of humility and, I guess, willingness to change, but recognizing that oversimplification is part of that, and I'm always going to be, changing over the course of my life and with new experiences.
What's interesting that you just did that I think is really helpful is, instead of asking how do those people out there need to change, you just said, how do I need to change in order for me to be able to better innovate? And that's, I need to be aware of my own the short-sightedness of my own mental models. And I think a lot of the message of innovation has to start with us. If I walk into a group and telling them, this is all the things you all need to do differently, it becomes very judgmental. But if it talks about, here are the things I need to learn, and here are the things we need to learn together, and let's listen together to our people, that becomes a very different kind of a thing. Anything else before I take you to the next chapter? The next chapter argues that leadership begins with listening. And it asks, who do we listen to? What do we listen for? And how do we listen well? And it argues that until you have been transformed by listening, until you have been transformed by empathy, you are not ready to innovate. And I think that is the hardest concept to communicate to our churches. That until you yourself have been transformed by empathy, by listening to the longings and losses of the people entrusted to your care, until you've done that, you're not yet ready to innovate. What do you all think about this idea that innovation can only happen when people have been transformed by empathy? Does that fit with your experience? Do you have processes that you've designed to help with that? Give me some examples of that.
Our state Baptist paper this week included an editorial, and I'm sorry, not an editorial, a letter to the editor, and it was printed in its entirety in a shaded box in a prime location in the state Baptist newspaper. And it was the comment of an older pastor who was focusing on the need for Southern Baptists to give more attention to orthodoxy. And when I read it, I thought, I understand where he's coming from. Bless his heart, good person. But it suggested to me, what about what the church, what Southern Baptists in particular are doing to help with the longings and losses of people over against getting everything up to specification in terms of right teaching? And to me, I'm from the Southern Baptist background, although I am a moderate Baptist. To me, that's the most obvious example of a church that needs to recalibrate, because the message of right belief doesn't connect with someone who's trying to pay their rent this week. So I very much identified with this chapter, Scott, and the longings and losses and the possibilities that congregations that really want to tap into that element, not to discount Christian faith and belief and all of the other stuff, but it's the hurts and hopes, the longings and losses that seem to be where our energy ought to be looking and focusing.
Yeah, you're right, Michael. And I think that can only really come from a deep listening. And, for our initiative, the whole first year, we just invited the congregations to listen to the people in their pews. They weren't to do they didn't put their project proposal or anything together for a whole year. It was just listening. And the ones that did that well and deeply are right now in a much better position to respond to the needs of today, what's coming up in this time of pandemic and other upheaval, than the ones that didn't really listen, that kind of checked some of the boxes for the initiative form, but kind of did their own pet project. Those are the ones that I'm seeing now that are struggling much more to kind of figure out, okay, what do we do in this time that church looks really different? How do we respond? What do people need? Because they just weren't as on the ground, with their people as those that practice this empathetic listening.
Nancy, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to share how hard this is for churches. With our calling churches, we started them out and just sent them out to listen to people outside of their walls, like people who don't attend their church. And that was really hard, first of all, for them to even think of gathering with people that aren't a part of our community. But then they had no idea of what do we do with what we've heard? Like, we heard from busy parents that can't come to church. So what are we going to do with that? I mean, it was just remarkable to us how difficult that was for them. And we've spent part of our third year just trying to help our churches learn to listen. That is we have done this whole training program with them to help them learn to listen. So this is just really foreign. And I think you're really right. Unless it's one of those foundational steps that unless it happens, you're really not ready to innovate. But we really need to take time with it. So that was really good that you guys did that, Jesse.
One of the things that it took me a while to be able to articulate to churches is we started out with just telling them, you have to listen. But they thought that the reason they were listening is so they could figure out what to say. And so we had to change that to say the purpose of listening is for me, myself, to be transformed by empathy. And that they would say, how do I know I've listened long enough? I know I've listened long enough when I myself have been transformed. So when I hear about busy parents and all that stuff, at first the response is, what am I going to do with that? Well, eventually it's going to get to the point where I am feeling empathy for busy parents and feeling their sense of being overwhelmed. And I'm now wanting to do something not so that I can figure out how do I sell something to them, but how do I make their lives better?
I think one of the things. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the reasons I think people have such an issue with it is because you say empathy cannot want control. And that's so, I think most people, if they were to be self-aware enough to admit it, they just want to be able to control and predict. And I think we do listen to say something in response because we want that control, and to be able to say, you're just listening to be transformed and to not be in control. Most of us can't let ourselves go there. I think of Anne Lamott when she says, I have teensy control issues, but I think that's the challenge. And for churches, Jesse, what you were saying, we've experienced too. We have some churches that were like, oh, great, we had a project we've been wanting to do, but they didn't take time to take it even congregation wide, much less to the broader community, Nancy, like you're saying, because then they might lose control of it. They might decide to do something else, and heaven forbid we be open-minded, or open to these new ideas. They have to give up some of that control, and that's really hard for us, even though it's only perceived to begin with.
Jesse
It's,
Duster?
it's interesting because I was going to say something similar to that, Kelly. And I think what I've noticed with churches is they don't think they're trying to control things, but you catch like the teams that come through the innovation process with us say things like, how do we get them to X? Or if only I could get my people to, and I think there's key words like that that can help us start to notice when we're doing controlling things. And I wonder if even talking about control with specific vocabulary like that will help us to notice our own tendencies to control.
I think a significant part of our job is to plant vocabulary, just to get people to be able to notice the things that are already part of their mental models, like I want control. So for example, the same woman, Erica, that was working in Florida with middle schoolers, she did empathy training with her leaders. And they decided on a rule that every time they listened to a middle schooler, they could only do it if they had a glass of water or a bottle of water in front of them. And it said, every time I want to say, yeah, but, I take a sip of water and instead say, tell me more. And, you know, they joked about that. And then they noticed how often it happened and how much they want to say, yeah, but. And so giving people a specific thing to do to prevent them from doing their own kind of control issues, it's a good start. The other thing that, oh, Saeed, you want to say something?
I struggle with this conversation because half of me is answering from the perspective of being a hub member and resourcing churches, and the other half is being a pastor 21 years.
Yes, yes, go for it.
And my most recent charge where I am right now, I guess where I'm coming from is that I feel even after going through the process of listening, of going through the process of engaging in empathy, I think people will oftentimes, the congregation will oftentimes say that they embrace the idea of innovation and being ready to do that. But when it actually comes, we sort of go back to that comment in chapter 1 about being afraid of what we're going to lose. And that fear of loss can be so great that it can overwhelm you even into moving into something new. And so, for instance, like in my church, we reached a point where after 2 years, I never thought I would hear these words come out of my mouth. And we're really good American Baptists, and so I don't force anybody to do anything. But the words were, we recognize that the people who are here, we don't have the energy, the desire, or the spirit to engage in the community around us. And so we would rather just focus on who is here. Instead of going through work to engage the rest of the world to do greater things. And so, me being a pastor and being a good Baptist pastor, allowing them to walk in that decision and then having to start something new without them. So it's a really interesting dynamic in that, at least from my perspective, the takeaway is that even given all of the right pieces, if that fear is so great, and if there are not members within them, because at the end of the day, I'm the outsider coming in, people who have been at the church longer than I've been alive. But unless there's a voice from within that can push against that fear, that you are still held back.
So part of what you're asking is, how do we be respectful to listening to our own people when they are so exhausted? I think that's important. Another thing you're asking is this: how do you help people change who desperately need to change and desperately don't want to change? And we're not going to cover that today, but chapter 8 is all about that. It's called Innovation and Change. And especially, there's a long example there of a church just outside of Seoul, Korea, and where they absolutely positively had to move and absolutely positively could not move. They absolutely positively had to respond to change and absolutely positively couldn't. And now what do we do? And what I love about that is the way that the pastor didn't force change, but just kept telling them the stories about what the lack of change was going to cost them. Not your church will die, but you will no longer live out the things that are important to you. And just let them live in that space of creative tension for, I think it was 18 months before they finally had an answer to what they were going to do. The point is, I've worked with a lot of churches where the pastor's first thing is, clearly everybody else needs to change and I don't need to change. And part of the learning and the listening exercise is to help them realize that the pastor needs to change. But then also, my people don't want to change. Therefore, I don't have any options. And chapter 8 is all about what are the options that you have if your people don't want to change. And it's ways in which we can invite them into a new story. They have to discover the problem for themselves. They have to discover this. Well, the example we're going to use later on is you can't quit smoking for somebody else. You can't decide for somebody else you need to change. But what can you do? Now we're back to planting and watering. You can create an environment conducive to change. And it's a tricky thing. It's a very complicated thing because there's no guarantees. I was working with a pastor of a church that I've worked with a lot. And he essentially told me, I don't have time to listen to people. I'm too busy preaching and teaching. And I said, well, how do you prevent from treating your people as a stereotype where if you don't listen to them and their world is changing, how do you know? And he goes, well, I know. Well, how do you know? Well, I talk to my friends and I talk to people. And I said, so everyone in the church is a projection of you and your friends? No, not that at all. But I know. And that was the answer. Yeah, I know. And I have continued to work with this person. And over the course of 3 years, I am no further along. Okay, that's fine. But unless someone is willing to be transformed by listening, it will be very hard for their world to be any different. Other thoughts or comments? Oh, I wanted to throw something out. Somebody asked something earlier and it made me think. One of the things that we need is to provide habits for congregations, habits of change. One of the phrases that I used to teach my MBA students was, what gets measured gets done. So how do you measure listening? Well, here's what what I've done with the congregations I've worked with. I've said, okay, if you're serious about this, every time your staff meets, ask only 3 questions. Who did you listen to this week? What did you hear? And who are you going to listen to next week? Don't even start with the church board. Don't start with it. Just start with the people that are employed by the church. That might even be 3 people. But whatever it is, who did you listen to? What did you hear? And who are you going to listen to next week? And if you continually ask that question, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because now I recognize that it's something that's important to us and that I don't want to come to the meeting next week saying, well, I didn't listen to anybody. Or I don't want to come to the meeting next week saying, I don't have a plan for who I'm going to listen to next week. And that it means that it's important enough that you're going to start collecting the stories. And just collecting the stories is enough that you can then sit down and say, okay, what are we hearing? But just providing a habit of asking questions on a regular basis. Who am I going to listen, or who did I listen to? What did I hear? Who am I going to listen to? That can begin to change a community. I have had people come back to me and say, well, I had one group that essentially bailed on a parallel project, not the Innovation for Vocation project, but a parallel one, a youth ministry innovation one. They basically bailed because they said, we started listening and we found it was so disturbing what we were listening that the volunteers in our group didn't want to listen anymore because they didn't want to hear that anymore. And I think we're going to have to bail on this project. Well, I convinced them to try to stay and we worked on that. But listening is dangerous. Listening is vulnerable. That's why, there's a phrase that in the book, empathy is vulnerable. That's part of the reason people don't want to do it. Any thoughts or comments? We have about 5 minutes left before we're done for today.
Scott, I was wondering as I was reading that about there's a lot of talk these days about kind of toxic personalities, and one of the regardless of whether or not that's a helpful term, that there are certain people who will sometimes they're kind of complainers. A lot of churches have certain folks that it's like you can't not listen to them, and it can just be over time, it can lead to a lot of kind of that same attitude that you were seeing with that congregation where it's almost like sometimes people can prey on empathy in a way. And maybe that's the wrong way of thinking of it, but it just seems like it's almost like you have to have a lot of resources to prevent burnout, kind of to self-care even for engaging in this work, because it can be so tiring, especially around if you have folks like that you're coming into contact with. Do you have ideas or ways of engaging in those kinds of situations?
In my experience, and all I've got to go on here is the experience I've had with congregations, I could be wrong on this. The more people you listen to, the less the toxic people bother you. Because if all you're listening to is the toxic people, okay, I'm going to do listening, I'm going to listen to the same person 73 times, that becomes really draining. But if I start spending time with lots of different people, the toxic person's voice doesn't sound so loud. And so I can have empathy for that person because I don't have to spend all of my time with them. One of the phrases we use in my leadership class is to value the dissenter. And that's the person that is going to be the most annoying, and often the person that's going to teach you the thing that you don't want to hear. Some percentage of them will never teach you anything, and that's life. And some percentage of people are going to actually teach you something, but it's going to be a painful lesson. But it's easier to deal with the toxic person if you've already dealt with a lot of other people, because it turns out that listening to people, we are built for that. That's what we were created for as humans. We were created for a community. And so the more people that you listen to, the easier it is to have one or two toxic people in your life. It's just the opposite of what people expect, is that if I start listening, I'm just going to, well, no, I mean, the group that said, I don't want to hear this anymore, what they were hearing was over and over again, this was a group dealing with middle school and high schoolers, is that being a high schooler is much harder than when I was a kid. And they were a little bit overwhelmed by that because they were taking their own experience 20 years ago and mapping it onto high schoolers now. And they were seeing that being a high schooler now, you are a lot more anxious, busy, and stressed than you were 20 years ago. And they found that life overwhelming. Well, they hung in there, and we'll see what happens. But does that respond, Nathan?
Yes, thank you very much.
So I want to end by listening. There's a bunch of ways we've got 2 more weeks of this. We're going to do chapters 4 through 6 next week and 7 through 9 the following week. Is this format of I summarize a little bit of a chapter and then I ask a question and then we talk through it together? Is that a good format? Or would you like more directive questions? Would you like questions in advance? I mean, there's a lot of ways that I could do this to make it better for you. I'll give you 2 minutes to just simply say, is there anybody here, we've got a couple minutes till we're done, that would like to see a different structure, or has this structure been good for you? I got a thumbs up from Rodney, which is pretty much all I need. So, okay, well then we'll just continue with this structure. I want to pay attention next time to the question of what process do we use to help the people entrusted to our care to innovate? And then the 2 weeks from now, we're going to pay attention to the question of how do we build organizational cultures, whether it's in congregations or seminaries, that are open to innovation. So next week, we're going to talk about the process, and then the following week, we're going to talk about culture. Any other last comments before we're done for today? So the last thing I'm going to ask you is this. Does anybody have, Laura's already answered this. Does anybody have a story from the first 3 chapters that most stood out for them? I want to end on a shared story of future hope. Laura said the MRI story of how they didn't need a new piece of equipment. They needed a new story. Any other story stand out for you?
For me, I love the Mad Libs, teaching the middle schoolers how to lament. But it came from a lot of listening first, like what's wrong here? What's going on? And and then doing something middle schoolers would do, doing the Mad Libs, but then uncovering so many beautiful things and giving them a way to communicate what's going on in their hearts. It's beautiful.
Great. Anybody else? Going once? Okay, well then I will just simply say, let me close in prayer. Thank you, God. Our churches are stronger than they know because they don't realize how much you love them. Allow them to get a glimpse of your love and allow that to give them the courage to innovate. In your name, amen. I'll send out 2 more invitations to all the folks who signed up, and I hope I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you all. Love being
Thank
with
you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Question.